Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for being here. Let me welcome you, dear ladies, dear gentlemen from all over the world. Let me welcome you, dear friends, friends of Berlin Art Week, friends, I'm sure, of Berlin, and therefore friends of a liberal society and a free democracy. Those are the preconditions for any sort of art. First of all, let me thank you. Thank you, dear Susan Moore, dear distinguished speakers, for sharing later on the panel for us, talking to us, and of course, still a bit later on, discussing with us. Thank you then, foremost, dear colleagues of Stiftung Brandenburger Tor, for organizing the event, and especially so Franziska Fenner and Sebastian Pflum. I'd rather go as far to say, without Sebastian, certainly no talking, rather probably no business, and I'd even go as far to say maybe no art. So thank you for eventing art, talking business. Welcome then to Max Liebermann House. Max Liebermann House today is home to Stiftung Brandenburger Tor. It's a, as we say, cultural foundation. It's a charitable trust established by Berlin Savings Bank. Berlin Savings Bank now, in turn, is a very traditional Berlin institution. It's a municipal bank. It's a governmental bank established by the citizens of Berlin 200 years ago. It is a bank obliged by law to serve the common good. If you now say, well, it's a contradiction in words to have a bank and to serve the common good, you are right in most cases. I hope not in this. Welcome again to Max Liebermann House. Once again, it used to be home to the Liebermann family, whose most famous offspring we all know. It's the talented son Max, one of the most gifted painters in Europe, at least around 1900. But also a man, a gentleman, a man of Berlin society, a celebrity, that had to suffer from all the political events that took place in those years. So when he died as a Jewish citizen of this city in 1935, there was virtually no one to attend his funeral. And only 7 years before, at his 80th birthday, there were thousands of Berliners celebrating him as the president of the Academy of Fine Arts. His wife, Martha Liebermann, a socialite and a host to many, many events in this house 80, 90, 100 years ago. She took her life on the evening before she eventually was to be deported to one of the extinction camps in the East. So this house has seen 200 years of Berlin, of German, of European, and I must say, unfortunately so, world history. It saw the rise of Berlin from the Brandenburg Sand to become one of the leading metropolises of Europe. It saw the Weimar Republic, the Roaring Twenties, by then the best days the city had had. And it saw the decline of this democracy, the abyss into National Socialism. It saw complete destruction, self-inflicted harm, and it saw a Berlin Wall being built and collapsing. So it is with this special history in mind and the history of this site that I would like to make what I say is a humble proposal. And in doing so, I'd like to address you one last and further time. I think we've all been watching television during the last few weeks. There's a new famous TV series. We all know its name. It's called Houses of Parliament. the complete Series 1, Houses of Commons. And there, I'd address you like the members. So, dear honorable members of this House, or for the more senior ones, those who feel more senior, I must say, dear right honorable members, I'd like to propose to include something in the questions we are going to discuss on the panel. The first question is, how do museums cope with new challenges? And new challenges are most likely defined as new audiences, new media, new fancy sorts of art objects. I'd also would humbly suggest to widen the scope of the question a little bit into the political sphere. What are the political challenges to museums today? We should not forget that, say, Abu Dhabi is number 147 on the Economist's Democracy Index. There's no reason to be proud that Germany is number 13. What I now say is very self-critical. On the 9th of November, which, as you all know, is a date of fate in German history, we felt obliged to establish a new association here called The Many, Die Vielen. There we assemble 1,200 cultural institutions all over Germany and help them stand up against right-wing populism. So even in Germany, it is necessary to stand up and to, well, stand up for our democracy. On the very same day, the 9th of November 2018, while we were having dinner in the evening here with European friends, Vice-Chancellor of the University of Oxford, the Ambassador of France from over there, in front of Liebermann's balcony right here, again, Nazis were demonstrating and shouting. So, if you're going to discuss the question, what are the challenges for museums, let's also think about the political preconditions, the political environment in which artists and museums have to work. Second, artists' estates, who cares? Let us care not just for those that are secure with their estates and their future even after their death. Let us, and that's my second humble proposal to this House, let us also mind those whose estates and whose works are not secure, be it in the past, like Max Liebermann's estate, that was scattered by the Nazis, or be it today, or be it in the future. So this is the very place where we try and strengthen democracy by means of culture. This is the purpose of Stiftung Brandenburger Tor. This is the heritage of this House. And this is where I once again, dear honorable and right honorable members, would like to very warmly welcome to Max Liebermann House in Berlin. Thank you very much.
How about if, well, why don't we have Julien, you here, and Juliette in the middle. Good morning. I'm definitely going to be speaking in English, and even without a Schwabian accent. But today we are considering how do museums cope with new challenges? And this is obviously a vast subject. And in attempting to answer this, we are proposing to focus on three main issues. How do museums engage with new audiences? What kind of experience should or could they offer? And also, what are the political challenges that are basically underpinning all of these? What might be considered more sort of superficial considerations, but in our increasingly polarized world, we seem to have museums that are either struggling to find audiences or to seem relevant, or at the other end of the spectrum, museums that have become a victim of their own success, that they're exhibitions and even their permanent galleries are so overcrowded that the experience of visiting them is frankly awful. And today we have brought together speakers who represent both the public and the private, and the old and the new. Julien Chapuis is a medievalist, formerly a curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and now deputy director of the Bode Museum here in Berlin. And Juliette Singer was director of collections for Paris Musée and is now chief curator of modern and contemporary art at the Louvre Abu Dhabi. And Daniele Maruca is director of the private Foelle collection, also in Berlin. And I'm going to begin by asking Julien, who is the sole representative of a historic state museum, two questions. What do you think are the main challenges facing your institution today, and what are you doing to address them?
Thank you very much. The first answer to the first question, in my opinion, is quite simple. The biggest challenge facing museums like my own is to establish a durable bond with younger audiences and with local audiences. And I will expand on that in the answer to the second question. I have prepared a few remarks about what we have done in the last years and about the challenges facing the Bode Museum and facing me since I arrived here in 2008. The Bode Museum is one of the 5 houses on museum houses on Museum Island. It opened in 1904. It reopened in 2006 after many years of restoration. It is a quote-unquote traditional museum with a superlative collection of sculpture. You have Riemann, Schneider, Donatello, Bernini. It's the old masters of sculptures are all represented here. In addition, it's a palatial architecture. It opened as a Kaiser Friedrich Museum in 1904, and its architecture reflects the architecture of the royal palace as it was before the Second World War. So it's a difficult museum, especially in addressing new audiences and young audiences, because young people feel shut out. They feel they don't belong there. They can't really identify with the collections, which are Christian for 80% in iconography, and the architecture is very off-putting. The museum feels like a fortress to them. The traditional audience was, when I arrived, an aging audience. The German term is Bildungsbürgertum, so the educated bourgeoisie, if you want. And the other thing is there was no education program for adolescents. Our education program stops at age 12. So as soon as puberty set in, we had nothing left to say. We didn't have the museums did not have any resources for them. So I believe that museums are, especially in Europe, the situation is slightly different in the United States, but I think museums are at a crossroads. So the allocation of public funds, and this is a development that is clearly underway and really advanced in places like the United Kingdom or the Netherlands, that the allocation of public funds is divided according to perceived societal relevance. And you have this in the Netherlands, where the Rijksmuseum receives the lion's share of state funding because it is considered to be central to national identity, whereas the Tropenmuseum, which the Museum of the Tropic, which opened as the Colony Museum, was faced closure. The government wanted to shut it down in 2011 because the government said it did not contribute to Dutch identity. The elephant in the room here is that Dutch was the colonial power in Indonesia, a country 6 times the size of Europe, for 3 centuries. And in 2011, the perception among politicians and public opinion in the Netherlands is that there was no need for discussion about the colonial past of the Netherlands. So the museum was salvaged at the last minute. So really establishing a connection with young audiences is indispensable for the survival of the institution museum. But it's a self-serving objective. The second reason why we should engage in younger audiences and with the local population to answer your call is more idealistic and altruistic. And I'm absolutely convinced that museums can contribute to maintaining open and tolerant societies. And also, I know this sounds very quaint, but museums' engagement with art enriches life. And it allows you to ask questions. And to use a phrase that was coined by Ana Moreno, who's the curator of the head of education at the Prado, she talks of the museum as a lugar de normalización, as a place of normalization. She works with inmates from prisons in Madrid who are allowed to leave the prison during daytime. She takes them to the Prado. They talk about, they look at Velázquez, they look at Rubens, they look at Roger van der Weyden, and during that time they cease to be prisoners, but coming to the museums gives them an identity that creates value, that is reinforcing. And how am I doing on time?
Fine, so far.
Okay. So since I arrived, a question we've increasingly asked ourselves is, for whom are we here? The German phrase is für wen sind wir da, and whom do we serve? And I can assure you that it was not a self-evident question 12 years ago. And so I want to state that I think the museum is for everybody. We welcome everybody, perhaps with the exception of people who come to the museum to vandalize works of art or for neo-Nazis. But if you come, Ernst Gombrich, the art historian, said if you like Impressionist painting because it reminds you of an outing, a time when you were happy with your family, that's perfectly fine. If you want to come to the museum to escape the stress of daily life, that's also perfectly fine. If you want to study the stylistic development of Donatello or Raymond Chandler, that's also fine. So I don't think it is possible, I don't think it is ethically defendable to want to dictate the experience of visitors. So I'm really a proponent of a presentation that allows all kinds of experiences within the museums. So we've had all kinds of programs directed at a whole variety of audience. We participate in a program called Multaka, which was initiated by the Museum for Islamic Art. Multaka means encounter in Arabic. And it's a program that is directed at refugees from Iraq and Syria living in Berlin. And it's 4 museums take place, and refugees meet in the museum with other refugees and talk in Arabic about the collection, about whatever they want. We have programs for people with dementia. We have made quantum leaps in partnerships with schools. We have a large education program called Lab Bode, which is financed by the Kulturstiftung des Bundes. For 4 years, we have a partnership with 9 Berlin schools, and also trying to understand from the schools what they need from us in order to come to the museum. And this idea of opening up the museum has as an objective to allow communities and identities that didn't recognize themselves in a museum to feel welcome in a place like the museum. So because a subject in this, here's the challenges in presentation, I'd like briefly to mention 3 exhibitions of recent years in which we've tried to address some of these issues. In 2015, we marked the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II. And we put together an exhibition called The Lost Museum, das Verschwundene Museum. In 1945, in the last days of World War II, 2 fires in a bunker where the most precious works of the Berlin collections were stored destroyed large portions of the Berlin collections. And everything that has to do, obviously everything that has to do with Nazism and the Holocaust in the Second World War is a trauma, a taboo subject for Germany. I had the advantage of being a foreigner, and I think it made it easier to ask questions, which were much more difficult for German colleagues to ask. So we had countless works in storage that had been heavily damaged by fire, and for decades the museum didn't know what to do with it. And so I started we put these works out on view, and we had what I would call a polyphonic reflection on what to do with these works. We had conservators, we had archivists, we had historians. We had a perspective from Russia, many works that were in Berlin and in Moscow, and we've opened ways to establish partnerships with the Pushkin Museum on making these works available, accessible. And it's the exhibition I've never had until then. So many people ask me, do you really know what you're doing? But I felt the idea was, this is clearly a trauma, and dealing with a trauma is a private, personal experience. It's not a right way and a wrong way. So we decided to have different narratives in parallel in the exhibition that allow different perspectives to be heard. And I believe very strongly, we had this discussion yesterday, I said, we're going away from this single narrative. I'm not ready to allow everybody to say anything they want about the museum or its contents, but I think we need to be willing to open the door for other narratives, other perceptions, and make these voices heard in the museum. Then we have an exhibition that is still, which we opened in 2017, which is still on view until the 24th of November, so please come see it. It's called Unvergleichlich, the English title is Beyond Compare. We have 100 works from Central and Western Africa from the collections of the Ethnological Museum on view at the museum. Some of the works are presented in direct juxtapositions in the permanent collections. In a special exhibition gallery, we have a large group of objects, European and African, grouped according to thematic subjects or thematic groupings. And so we ask questions like, how does art become art? None of the works in the Bode Museum was created to be displayed in a museum. And what I find interesting is that as soon as you go beyond the formal similarities or differences and you ask about the function these objects fulfilled, what were they made for, and you realize that in different cultures and in different times, the needs that these objects fulfill is very similar. So pretty much every society looks for protection and guidance, and many cultures use figural representation. So how does figural representation help in the search for protection? The last exhibition I'd like to mention is what we call an integrated exhibition, which we opened last Thursday. It's very fresh. It's called The Second Glance, der zweite Blick, and All Forms of Love, die Spielarten der Liebe. And it's an exhibition that allows LGBTIQ+ narratives to be found throughout the exhibition. So the idea is a traditional museum like the Bode Museum follows necessarily the heteronormative canon, but actually if you look at history, there are all kinds of queer stories to be told, from Mars being the god of war while at the same time having affairs with men and anything and we have female saints in the Middle Ages having a beard, growing a beard, so that they wouldn't have to be married off, etc. So the idea is we're not putting rainbows and pink triangles in the museum. We offer routes throughout the museum and offer possibilities to look at objects from different perspectives. And a thing that I found absolutely moving at the opening, which was exactly a week ago, we had 500 guests, and we had a performance by an LGBTI dancing company of color, and the choreographer was a black trans woman who nearly cried when she spoke and said she had been working on a speech she'd done tried several speeches, but in the end, she couldn't write anything because the overwhelming thought that she had was that as a black trans woman, she did not belong in a place like the Bode Museum with its palatial architecture. So I think this is why I find this notion of Ana Moreno from the Prado as the museum as a place of normalization so important. The idea is that you open the door for audiences not normally represented, not normally at home in the museum. It doesn't mean that we are going to ridicule the collection. It just means there is not only a single narrative, no authoritative narrative. I think it's extremely important that if you stick to this notion of the authoritative narrative, you're going to lose, it leads to ostracism, it leads to segregation and to whole groups of the population not coming in. So I think I'd like to leave it here. Thank you. Thank you for your patience.
Juliette, the Louvre Abu Dhabi is also a state museum, but of course it's a brand new universal museum. So you have quite different challenges as well as the same dilemma about the narrative or narratives you are presenting. So perhaps you could talk a little about that.
So the challenges are quite different. We are quite a baby museum. We opened only 2 years ago, so it's very new, but it has already a long story, because before the opening it took a lot of time on what it means to create a museum like that. It is the first universal museum in the Arabic area. So I think the 3 challenges for us are the stabilization. We're in a very specific context. So you mean so United Arab Emirates are surrounded with other countries. You know the story. There are some wars around. So to trust that to build a museum and to create peace and tolerance, it's a special meaning in that very space in the world. So our narrative, we have a narrative, but I totally agree with what he said, but we have a narrative which starts in the antiquity, and it goes until today. So personally, I am in charge of the 19th to 21st century. And so it's like a loop, and it's like a journey through the times. So we try to show the story of humanity until now through artwork, masterpieces, artwork coming from all around the world with a very new approach. We are trying not to speak from a very part from the world. We are trying to make something quite with no center, actually. For example, we propose a room in the medieval time with a Bible, a Torah, a Quran, and a Buddhist text. It's not to put everything like that, but just to take time to understand the different meanings, the different stories, to put them together. It's very, very strong to do it in Abu Dhabi and in that Universal Museum. So for us, yes, the step is the stabilization to allow that museum to exist and to be an encounter place for people and to build some peace and tolerance through art and encounter the cultures. The second challenge is it's to make roots to that very new museum. So we trust it's very important to work with young people and for us to create, a true audience in the country. So we have a children museum. So we work a lot with children. It's the first time they come to such a museum. So now we have an exhibition dedicated to the costume. So children can come, we display many artwork, and they can really understand what is the meaning of a costume. It's not only about textile, it's about a shape, it's a pattern, it's about many symbolic things. So it's very strong for us. On the other part of the roots, it's for us by a scientific team to make the education of our colleagues, Emirati, to create the new team for them to be totally. Now we have half the team Emirati and half non-Emirati. So the balance is becoming growing up with Emirati people. But for us, it's very important also because for a new museum to be able to create some research department to how to find the good acquisition, how to make sure we don't buy something that can be not deontologic, or to make all that research to be sure to have the very high quality, to also be able to go further in the future and for it to be a real museum, like a place to think, a place to encounter, a place to create ideas, a place to look at the world. So it's that roots in the country is very, very important. On the third thing, and we are speaking about business today, it's also a question of to attract people for them to come in that new museum, because it's a big investment in a tourist and cultural government. So we are very lucky because we have huge audience, more than 1 million last year. Our first public is Chinese and Indians and people from Europe, but from all around the world. What is very exciting is to see that that question of universal, it's very working. I mean, we are trying not to address some community, but to be open to everyone. So every labels are in 3 languages, English, French and Arabic, obviously, but we are making different translation for all those audience. And me, in my specialty, it's very important to try to finish, that loop, or that journey, starting on the antiquity and arriving now, for people of today to be involved in that universal. So we just opened a new installation, very polysensorial. It's from Susanna Fritscher. She's from Austrian. She's Austrian, sorry. And it's a huge installation playing with light. The name is Für die Luft. And so you go through it, some threads in very silicone threads, like white, and you go like in a labyrinth. It's playing with light, so it's a very beautiful play with a building. The building is made by Jean Nouvel, and it's like a rain of light and very meaningful in the Emirates, because the museum itself is like a Medina. You go through like a small square white building, and above you have that dome playing with light. So that installation from contemporary artist Susanna Fritscher, it's like a play with those rain of light, also for people to go inside, to encounter themselves, and to become themselves part of the artwork. So that is a way I try to answer your question.
Thank you. And Daniele, for those amongst us who don't know about the Fuela collection, I think it would be really helpful if you could tell us a little about the museum, which is, of course, so different to these 2 other institutions, and its radical approach to presenting works of art.
Thank you, Susan. Good morning to everybody. Indeed, it's a private museum, or is a private art space and not a state institution. And it has a very individual, already radical approach, because it's coming from the vision of the founder, Désiré Feuerle, who worked for over 30 years at his collection, and a select number of pieces is now on display at the Feuerle collection here in Berlin. And together with his wife, Sarah Puig, he founded the Feuerle collection here in 2016. So it's quite a recent project. And the research for the right building took a long time, and also the research for the right partner as an architect took a long time. And in the end, Berlin was chosen, and a specific building, which is a former telecommunications bunker, built between 1941 and 1944. But they were not looking for a bunker. They were looking for the right place, for a place with the right personality. And actually, I would say, and this is what Désiré declared often, they found a building resembling a Donald Judd sculpture. And inside of this building, they started forming the Gesamtkunstwerk, the total artwork of the project Feuerle collection in Berlin. The focus is completely different. There are, if I can just make a list of very radical points concerning the display, there are no labels, no texts. The museum has a synesthetic approach, so there's a combination of senses in the perception of art. There's a will to go back to discover a sense of private and silent wonder for the pieces. The pieces have to stand for themselves. There is specific language to describe them, and that's a light design. Everything has been curated by Desiree Feuerle, and it took a long time to find exactly the nuances or the details he wanted to put an emphasis on. To enter the exhibition space, the visitors have to stay for almost 3 minutes in a completely dark sound room with music by John Cage, music for piano number 20. And then they enter. The eyes have obviously adapted somehow to darkness, and they enter a space in which light, specific light, is describing the surfaces of the sculptures. There are early Khmer sculptures from the 7th to the 13th century, and imperial Chinese furniture from the Han Dynasty to the Qin Dynasty, and contemporary art. And it's a system of juxtapositions, but it's not a system of iconologic juxtapositions. It's a very personal, emotional, and I would say a creative way to put together the pieces so that they are in dialogue with each other and they create a new world. So the visitor is actually asked to slow down. We are a completely mobile detox, this is how we call ourselves. So you actually leave your mobiles inside of the lockers. Then you enter the space without any chance to be distracted. No pictures are allowed. And you are passively accompanied by an expert, by somebody who is there to give information in case you need information, but nobody is going to point out what are the important parts of the collection. And so you're actually invited to walk slowly and silently through the heart of a collector who's showing his passion, he's showing the juxtapositions he had in his mind for so many years, and he actually concentrated exactly on the way he wanted the pieces to be on show. So this is why it's a total artwork. And John Pawson, as a master of minimal architecture, understood how to work with Desiree and translate into an absolutely refined architectural language the vision and the ideas that he had, and took the time together with Desiree to discover the building, respect the building, and to a certain extent change it also. Although the surfaces are not changed, and the restoration has been actually very, very light, but inside of the lower ground floor exhibition space, there's a lake. There's a lake room, 2,500 square meters filled with water. This changes completely the perception of space. Suddenly, we lose the sense if we are up or we are down, and we walk through this world of shadows, which is actually also incredibly poetic, but everybody can discover it. It's his own or her own way. And then you can look at the space, which looks empty. It's an art piece curated by or created by Desiree, and then you discover there's water inside. And in the middle of the lower ground floor, we have a room dedicated to the Imperial Chinese incense ceremony. So this is another aspect of the synesthetic approach. Actually, the full experience of this museum is when you visit the collection, you walk around, and you also take part in an incense ceremony. And so you enter a space which has been entirely curated to concentrate only on a combination of incredibly beautiful scents, the incense, and as a contemporary performance is part of the vision of one person. So what interested me, and I feel honored they asked me, Sarah and Desiree, to follow them, to join them in this journey, was to observe how precise the eye of the collector in this case is, how precise he works with his own feelings, no compromise. He's really working, first feeling exactly what he wants and then realizing it. And then that we invite everybody to follow this and to feel together or alone inside of a space, what they first can feel. And then I would say after 3 years, we can now say because we have a special system of online booking, so we accept only 14 people maximum for every visit, so that everybody is more or less alone in this large space of over 7,500 square meters. And 14 people for 2.5 days every full hour means that actually now in the 3rd year we are over 30,000 visitors. And we can now say that the youngest generations reacted very well. We have mostly visitors who are between 16 and 34. This is extremely young from my viewpoint. And we know that they're interested in many aspects of lifestyle. They don't come from the art world. They're not there to research the pieces. They're there to feel and to enter a space in which the collector opened the doors to anybody. Everybody can book and just perceive the pieces. So I would say this is what I would say right now. Then I'm waiting for your question.
Yes, no. Well, I mean that is the most extraordinary thing about it. It's because you have the privilege and luxury that no state museum, public museum has of turning people away, and you are offering a one-to-one experience in a way that is very difficult in a very crowded public museum. And Julien mentioned funding being related to societal relevance or perceived societal relevance. In the UK, it's also related to perceived educational value. And I feel that this, I've got nothing wrong, nothing against the educational aspect of museums. Of course, it's terrifically important, but I think that what's happened is that there has been a loss of museums enabling people to actually feel works of art, to experience them, to engage with them, because you're always being pushed away, you're always aware of other people, of the next thing. And I wonder if you think that there is a way, if there is, it is part of your mandate to allow people to first experience works of art before you actually tell them about it.
I'd like to tell a very old anecdote. Phil Nolan, who founded the Getty Leadership Institute, tells the story that 50 years ago he was an intern in the US Congress, and very young, and one day at the National Gallery he saw an elderly senator, a very famous person, and because he was young, brave, and without fear, he went to the senator and asked, "Senator, why do you come to the National Gallery?" And the man who was alone said, "I'm visiting with my wife," and he was a widower. And he came to the National Gallery to see his wife's favorite paintings. So feeling is absolutely essential. But as I said at the beginning, I think it is something that you have. This type of experience is, for me, the golden target, the golden aim that we should all work for. We should hope that this type of experience is possible in our museums. But I think it is absolutely impossible, and it's unethical to want to engineer it. So,
unethical?
Well, how... not unethical. I think there is no way to say, I want you to think in front of this painting about your dearly departed ones, for instance. That is what I meant.
Prescriptive,
Sorry,
yeah.
yes. So what I mean is, I very strongly believe that presentations, I come from the Metropolitan Museum, I'm an art historian. Philippe de Montebello was my model in many ways, and Prawn talked about the aura of a museum. And so in the exhibition that we still have on view on African sculpture, we tried very strongly to put objects. The central question is the distinction between ethnology and art history still relevant? So we present objects and allow them to shine. We're criticized by post-colonial movements for not putting provenance and acquisition much more in the forefront. But I think this goes against, and the Grassi Museum in Leipzig has a presentation of African sculpture where African sculpture is presented only from the point of view of restitution. You have Benin bronzes in packing crates, and so there is no way to look at these sculptures as works of art. The whole issue, how were they acquired, are they rightfully here, is the only thing you see. So I feel museums, what I found extremely impressive, I've not been to Abu Dhabi, but what I found extremely impressive yesterday in the Feuillet collection is that the space allows you this aesthetic and sensorial and emotional approach to the works. And it's something that we work very hard to maintain at the Border Museum in the presentation of objects to the proper height. I don't think we should overwhelm people with texts. I think digital media give us wonderful tools to make this information available if people want it. But I feel very strongly that the presentation should allow this multiplicity of approaches and emotional engagement.
Well, one thing that Daniele didn't mention is the most fabulous thing about, or one of the many fabulous things about the collection, which you all have to see, is that as soon as you go in, your mobile phones are taken away. So you cannot take a picture or walk around like this. I mean, we've all been to museums where people are not even, they spend more time reading the labels than looking at the images, and then quite a lot of them are actually not even looking at all. They're looking through the lens of a camera. And, and James Bradburn, for example, at the Brera, has actually just banned also phones and all technology from the museum, and that is a very valid approach, although they are wonderful tools, but of course, are you using a lot of digital media? To sort of get around the problem of all these different languages and.
Yes, but first I want to find the way to say that in Louvre Abu Dhabi we have that double approach with very aesthetical and powerful, shock to discover. And what is very important for us, the very first room, we call it the Core Vestibule, and all the museography was made by Jean Nouvel, and the showcase are like icebergs floating on the water. On the floor you have the map of a coast with the name of all the city or the place the works you will see are coming from. So you enter, and so you have a compass on the floor with that coast. The compass is like a portulan that invite you to a journey. So you go to that very beautiful room with all that showcase with different shapes, very transparent, very white, and you don't have so much text. And first we didn't put any introductive text, but after people wanted some, so we add some introduction on the wall, but if you don't want to read it, you don't read it. But just you start the museum like discovering like that. So it's not as radical as you. We have some labels and also, but discrete. On those showcase, it's thematic. You have different, for example, you have 3 mortuary masks in gold, one coming from South America, one from China, one from Europe. And just you look at that showcase, and just you don't have to think about, you just understand that the same things happen in different parts of the world. At the same time, we don't know why, we don't know what, but it's like to open the box of question and to say, okay, you start the journey and you will discover different things, and we are putting more light on the common point between artists than in the different things between the civilization.
One comment. I think it's an extraordinary luxury, Daniele, that you have to take people's phone away. I don't know how logistically this is done at a museum like my museum, but I want to say that I believe 70% of younger people under 20 in Berlin, have a smartphone or an iPhone, even though a third of children in Berlin live under the poverty level. Apparently they all have an iPhone. And we have essentially no money for advertisement, and we've done a number of Instagram events, and with these events, which means opening the museum for 1 hour, with people, influencers coming through the museum taking pictures, we reach over 1 million people. So I think it is simply not realistic to say, leave your phone at the door. If people are moved by what they see at the museum and decide to take pictures and post that, that's fine. So
yeah, I totally agree. There is another point. For us, the priority in this case was the work of art itself, the total artwork, and the fact that the light conditions are so difficult for cameras to catch the exact proportions of the sculptures and the space without additional light, that even professional photographers we've been working with needed several days to catch it. So what we were afraid of was also that the people would first, of course, not concentrate on the pieces, but then also that a million of pictures would start circulating which are not describing what we offer, and that this would damage the picture of the whole project. So this is why we were so strict. But we are only 14 people. You ask them in the entrance. Nobody can enter alone. They all have to be accompanied, and we have lockers for this. So, but I completely agree with the fact that the digital or the virtual level of information is extremely important, and we also worked or started working on Instagram, and we want to expand this, and we want to provide additional information on the pieces on the Instagram. But that's after the visit or before or whatever, but not inside.
But it never seems to be very clear. It's all very well saying you're reaching 1 million people, but do you know? Is there any research that reveals whether these people actually ever come? Because what does reaching mean? I mean, what's the validity of having 1 million people looking at that image if that's all they do?
what I can tell you is that slowly, gradually, visitor numbers are improving.
Since this initiative?
Not
or
since
just
this initiative, since we've put in place these various programs.
Okay.
And when I say I have no money for advertising, I can assure you I have no money
For anything.
for this type of research. So
Yes.
it's a lot of improvisation, and really trying to experiment and see what might work and what might not work.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the... Sorry, Juliette.
No, just I think very interesting because we are always trying to make a balance between the quality of the approach and the quality of image we want to promote. In the case of Louvre Abu Dhabi, we think it's very nice if people take picture and go to Instagram, because it's a way people appropriate on the museum. They have their own museum. Also, the best images are mentioned every month. And it's like a play, and people coming from all around the world are so happy when they find something that are coming from their country, or they find it much interesting for them. So it's a way also to play with the universal. For every people can have his own approach and to diffuse it. But I think, it's
Not so different from collecting postcards.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, the Border Museum made it on Beyoncé's Instagram account, and this got us a lot of free publicity. But I must say, despite beyond what the number of visitors, I think it is a reality that that smartphones are an integral part of young people's life. And if you take it away from them, it's an authority gesture of authority, taking away something that is core to the identity of these people. So if you want to reach them and say, we're going to take away your phone, then does not really open the door for them, I think.
Well, thinking of talking of authoritarian gestures, I mean, Juliette, I mean, perhaps you could talk a little about whether, I mean, tell us whether there has been sort of state intervention in terms of the modelling of your museum and the stories it tells, and whether you have been constrained in any ways or encouraged in any other ways to modify your approaches.
Yes, no, actually, it's a very specific project. It's an intergovernmental project. So first, it was the wish of Emirati government to create a universal museum. So it was 10 years ago, more than that. So they came to Paris and they asked. So first they wanted Jean Nouvel to make the museum. So they had in mind the building. Then they wanted to create that universal. So they approached the scientific team from France to help them to create all the content and all that narrative and so on. So in that position, first I was working from Agence France Museum, that is dedicated structure that makes the in-between between Emirati and French government. And now I am directly working from government. It's a little bit technical, but for you to understand that indeed we have to have all that diplomatic approach, and we are benefiting from the loans of 13 French museums, Louvre, Centre Pompidou, and Guimet Museum, or different partners, Musée du Quai Branly, and so on. So that allow to have an overview really of all the different kind of works, and we are building the collection by buying new artworks. And so we don't have a pressure, we are very supporting the creation as a scientific team of that narrative. And I think, no, it's not. They were really trusting us in the way to work on that. They're working also to other two different museums, Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, that will open in few years, and National Zayed Museum. They will be our neighbors. So I think it will be interesting also for us to find a new position with two neighbors, because now we are the first one on the Saadiyat Island, so it's just a different position.
And is this a sort of very... we were talking about not having single narratives and not having a prescriptive approach. I mean, I do think that from what sort of Julien and I haven't been to your museum either, but the Foile is doing, in a way, is provoking questions amongst the viewers. And I think that's terrifically important, because this is something that hasn't really happened enough, because we've been just treated as entirely passive audiences who just are expected to absorb what we're told. And I think that this must be a way of enlivening the whole experience. Is to at the Foile, it's all about the provocations between contemporary Japanese photography and a sort of early Chinese stone bed or whatever. And in your global show, you have most extraordinary juxtapositions, which I continually looked at and thought, my goodness, I hadn't thought of that. This is absolutely right. We all are human beings with the same desires and fears, and we've responded in very similar ways. So do you think this is really where we're going with museums, is that we're trying to provoke, we're trying to be interactive in a human sense rather than in a technological sense?
Oh, well, I can say from my viewpoint, I'm not... let's say I'm not the founder, I'm the director, so I'm not the curator of the exhibition. I don't think that provoking is actually, in our case, like one of the most important aspects. I think one of the most important aspects is to invite people to see with the eyes of the collector, which is a quite unique experience. You suddenly can walk through multiple choices and visions of a person who collected pieces for his own pleasure. So, and how he was seeing and looking at them, and how he would like to share this with the others. Questions, we have many questions. We receive many questions, and our visitors, attendants are there to answer them. And if they become too specific, I'm at the disposal of the public on an email level, so they can write me and I answer. So we engage. And for the future, we would like to work more with universities and analyze our case, let's say, as a case study from multiple viewpoints and see what could be criticized, changed, adapted, maybe exported of this. We don't know. I mean, it's like every challenge is new, and so, but dialogue is important, yes. So I would say questions are welcome, yeah.
Well, perhaps questions are welcome. Perhaps we should. This is a good point to. Oh yes, before one more.
So asking questions, if the museum presents an object and say it's important because it's an early Riemenschneider, and Riemenschneider is the first sculptor who did X, Y, and Z, that's all nice. But if you find a way to make the viewer think about the object in terms of his or her own experience. If you talk, we have a very famous work in the museum is Mary of Mercy by Michael Erath, Schutzmantel Madonna. It's people taking protection finding protection under her cloak. And if you start talking about who needs protection, it's something that we can all relate to. And so this idea that if you find ways that anchor, that dock directly to people's experience, then the sculpture ceases to be something old and expensive on the wall or in a case, but it becomes a mirror in which we recognize each other. And I think this notion of recognizing oneself in the collection is key to identification with the museum. In terms, it's key with an identification of the local population with the institution, which then is key in getting society to think, yes, we should keep investing in these institutions.
Yeah, well, it's a question of relevance,
yes,
really, which is really crucial here.
The museum is a mirror
in
which we recognize where we come from and who we are.
I mean, the other problem is that I find it hard to believe that there's nothing in any museum that wouldn't be of some interest to a curious-minded person, but it's how you get them to cross the sort of portals in the first place, because I'm sure once they're inside they would be interested, but how do we suggest to people, the man in the street, as we say, that they would be, interested, entertained, touched, overwhelmed by doing this on a Saturday afternoon?
And in the UK, you are in a much more advantageous situation because the national museums are free, and which is a huge barrier. You have to pay 12 euros to come to the Border Museum, which means that you don't come if you have just 30 minutes. You need a whole afternoon. Yeah. Whereas at the National Gallery in London, I know people who work there who say they see every day the same people who work nearby, and on the lunch hour come and they look at 3 paintings and then go.
That's the best thing to do. And we're very fortunate. Now, I'm sure we have some questions here from the floor to one or all of the speakers. Everyone's being very shy. Yes.
Is this working? Yes. I have a question regarding the distinction between ethnology and art history, which you mentioned, Julien Chapuis. Should we also distinguish art historical or historical museums from, I guess, contemporary art or modern art museums or the Fayette collection, where it's more experiential? Should we still try to make a distinction between experiential museums and didactic museums? And if so, how do we make a didactic museum a good experience and a learning experience, while not without being prescriptive and without trying to impose narratives onto the objects whose history we're trying to portray or describe?
Thank you for this easy question. I think these are not mutually exclusive, and I would not, to put it in very simple terms, these are all things made by people for people. And essentially, you need to provide, I believe, I'm slightly uncomfortable with the idea that if you want to know anything about the works, you have to write an email to Daniele at the Feuerle collection. I would like the museum to tell me what I'm looking at. It's...
I mean, you can ask the experts who are there too. I mean,
Sorry?
you can also ask the experts who are there too physically, so up to a certain extent.
It's a very difficult thing to answer. I think I strongly believe in the aura of the object, but this has to do with my background and working at the Metropolitan Museum, that you really need the object to speak. It's something actually that Wilhelm Bode understood very well. He talks about the hierarchy of presentation. So the idea is that you should instinctively make your way through the museum and recognize the important object. Professor Schuster is here, and he gave me a great gift several years ago. He brought Jeff Koons to the Bode Museum. And it was an absolutely amazing experience because Jeff Koons clearly has a very keen aesthetic sense. He has no formal art historical training, so there are certain things that you are taught in first year of art history, which I didn't know about chronology, etc. But it was like a magnet. He went from one key work to another. We try to make this possible through the presentation. But so the idea that in the way the presentation is structured, you are led to the important works. I would like to know if I see, as in the Feuerle collection, that a Buddha head is in the center of a gallery. Clearly, it's considered one of the most important objects in the collection. Why do I have to wait until the head talks to me? A head will talk to me more easily than a stone table. I have a hard time getting a stone table to talk to me. But so I don't have a clear answer for you. I think some degree of explanation need to be there, but the experience should be as open as possible. I think that was interesting is that guests from Africa with whom I went through the exhibition, curators, their initial reaction was almost overwhelmingly that they were happy that these objects were shown in an art museum and not an ethnological museum.
I think it's really part of the challenge of museum today, not to keep thinking like ethnology, anthropography, Kunstmuseum. It's especially, for example, but I think we are all in the same situation on all the same question with different answer. It's a question of scale, a question also of what is what we want to show to the audience, but it's a question of statement also. In Louvre Abu Dhabi, we are both giving key because it's not nice not to give any key to people and if they want to understand, and it's very important also for people to understand how old is a work, for example, and because sometimes it's very perturbing. You have a work which just look very, very contemporary, and it is just the oldest major monumental sculptural work which exists, which has been founded in Jordani, and it's so it's important also to give some meaning to what is shown, but we have to deal with a new approach and it's like a puzzle, yes, and I think people have their own way to discover. They can just be amazed by something, and you have moved personally. It's very intimate. Why you see something and you feel it so strong for you, you will remember it, and it's very what you will keep it in your mind after leaving the museum. But also to give some key to help people to understand what is the story of the world, and we are speaking also about the context in Berlin, as everywhere in the world. In political, it's linked to history, and without history, it's becoming very difficult to build a future. So,
I also would like to say something. I totally agree also that it's a matter of scale. We are a project with different numbers and different approaches. And I also think instead of the very complex landscape of choices for didactic or educational projects, we are at the beginning. We are starting to face this on many levels. And it's a slow process, but also I believe in slowness, in this fact that actually we take the time, the visitor can take the time, and the dialogue, because the scale is so little, so small in our case, we take the time for each other. This is the idea, and we don't give up. I mean, it's like, it's legitimate to ask questions, to feel things. The feelings can change, and we are there to engage in an exchange of opinions, information, but all this in a very slow and very one-on-one scale, which is maybe what we're talking about, our luxury. So we really step back and get slow, silent and slow. Yeah.
Yes.
I would like to come to an image like, I remember as a child my first trip to London. My grandfather took me to the British Museum and later to the Tate. And I would say museums are too clean.
Too clean.
Too clean. I remember when I was the first time in the British Museum, I was totally lost as this boy. All these columns, thousands of artifacts, and almost no labels at that time. It almost felt like a bit like they're still on researching what is done, and it was not even in one pedestal cleaned up, the coins, next there was still a bone, next line. And for me it was really this moment, maybe the biggest invitation I ever got in my life, what kind of journey you will have. I have the feeling today when I go to a museum, it's cleaned up. It's not approaching me at all to my fantasy, not trying maybe to make wrong narrations. I remember the last time when I was in an education moment, a person tried to explain Francis Bacon to a group of children. When I saw this, it was cleaned up. There was nothing which hurts at the moment. But this work hurts. And if you want to make it accessible in the sense of that it doesn't hurt anymore, then it's not even the sense of this work done, and it's not accepted anymore in the way it was produced for. So this cleaning process in many, many areas, we can talk about the design, the light. I would say, for example, I know the Feuer collection, which is a beautiful moment, but when you really think about the time most of these work were produced, was extremely aggressive. These cultures of mostly the whole of their time in war. It's not only this little beautiful Buddha head standing there. It comes from a time where all these were major questions, and these questions were born by suffering. But there is no suffering anymore.
So it's about the sanitization of the exhibits. Yeah.
I think you're right to come back to the core of the museum, it's the works. So you are totally right on what I try to do at my museum, is to show that every artist at any time was a contemporary artist. So I think you are totally right to say it on at the core of museum. It's very the works and the people that were doing that, and it's so strong to look at something, and you have the feeling to be in dialogue directly with the ancestor of the person of today, but it's quite direct, and you can listen the work crying, shouting, or speaking to you. So what we are trying to do is just to allow that works to have the space to speak to us. And after the dispositif, I understand we have to do, but it's also a way to allow the work to speak by itself. If you want to put too many things, dirty things around, you will be disturbed also, I guess. So, but I think you're right to remember that at the core of museum are the work.
I agree with this.
I would like to ask, why do we devaluate teenagers so much? I mean, it's the generation that has so much to do with visual arts. It's like putting photo on Instagram really needs to, the whole process of how to make this narrative on Insta stories attractive to his colleagues. And so I also remember my anger being a teenager and visiting museums to observing people, adult ones, taking photos, and I would stand there and ask myself, why don't they watch? So it's not about evaluating myself then, but I so believe in youth. I was working with in educational field, and I see that there is no kind of problem with a dialogue, that they really want to do something with art, to understand it better, but it's maybe not the fact of taking mobiles away from them. Maybe it's somehow encouraging them to let go. So it's still a thing of a narrative, if we are superior to them or we are in a dialogue. So yeah, so that's the question, why do we devaluate them somehow?
I might
I
just
didn't
answer.
get the question, actually. Sorry.
I think, are you saying that we're devaluating them by reducing them to Instagram images?
Here was kind of a narrative that how should we make them attend the museums, but at the same time saying that how to make it, because they are on the Instagram all the time, so they wouldn't have this kind of notion for to have this one-to-one meeting with an object, or consciousness or something. Maybe it's our perspective is somehow wrong. I mean, institutional one.
Yeah, well, I think it's a fair point to say that we should be encouraged how to look. I think this is something that, in an odd sort of way, we've forgotten how to do. We've forgotten how to stop and be quiet and reduce our vision. And I think this is something. I'm very involved in the whole slow art movement of slowing people down, and I think this is something that should be encouraged much more. And I really do think that people have forgotten, in the way that in the past gallery goers would spend a very long time, looking slowly at their leisure. And I don't think it's just simply now to do with a lack of leisure time. I think it's to do with distraction, and I think there is a sort of element of preparation that needs to go into visiting a museum, which isn't necessarily listening to the John Cage. But I think the only way you can engage is to be in the right frame of mind, and it's pointless visiting a museum when you're not in that state of mind.
I mentioned that we asked people to pay 12 euros to come in. I can assure you that the people who are willing to invest this money spend a lot of time looking at works. The people who come to my museum really look.
Well,
that's my experience. I don't. So.
But doing a museum, in inverted commas, means looking at everything, and the experience of that, of looking at 500 things for a few seconds rather than looking at fewer things longer, is surely not a very profitable experience.
I think it's dangerous to generalize. Yes, you have people who queue for 3 hours to see the Mona Lisa and take a selfie. At the same time, you have the people I mentioned who go to the National Gallery several times a week to look at Paolo Uccello and Piero da Francesca, and I think there are all kinds of experiences in museums. I think it's problematic to say this is the trend now. At least for ancient art, that's my experience.
I think also we have a tendency to imagine that in old ancient time, people were very good and used to say 3 hours in front of a work. No, I think we have now more and more audience. It's very nice that more and more people are going to museum. In their lives, there are different stage, and maybe you can take more time at what time and less time. But for us to that people take picture, it's a way to appropriate, to put there in their own history. So for me, it's very positive, and to have the perfect moment to slow down and so on. It's we all want to, and we are passionate. I mean, we are all, when we go to museum, we take time, but people are going in their own life. They don't have so much time, so they catch what they want, and it's a freedom also to enjoy it. And there is that work in the, I don't know if it's in every law, but in the La Loi Musée in France, you have the word of délectation. So you have to delect yourself. So please enjoy it. And you don't have to be obliged when you go to museum to have the better way to look at it. If you just want, because you find it cool, I think it's better than to put a picture of food or your Instagram or your. So for me, anything is good if it's positive way to look differently to the world and to look on the world with looking at beauty, looking at the question of today, and to be moved anyway by to enjoy to be living. Museums don't have to be a place to be dead, but to live. So I think it's very important.
The museum, not the mausoleum.
Absolutely. Wow.
I think, yes, please.
I wanted to say it's the last question now before the coffee break. So
no pressure.
Thank you. Thank you very much for everything. I'm a tech entrepreneur, so I'm not going to go into the digital or technology aspect. But when we talk about the different generation, I talk about my generation and the generation under. I think one of the big difference there is that we're getting poorer in general. The notion of co-working space, VG, didn't really exist up to now. And I'm just wondering if the business model of ticket pricing, asking 12 euros or 15 euros to go in one go, because you need to do the whole museums, and I think you get like really tired after 1 or 2 rooms, is really the right model for this generation. Because once you pay this amount, then you feel that you really need to spend the whole afternoon there instead of, as you said, enjoying like 3-4 pieces and then coming back later. And in a world where we used to a subscription model or things like this, is it really the right model today, or is this something that should be updated maybe?
Good question.
Can I give an element of answer? I'm entirely on your side. I'm absolutely. I on a personal level would want museums to be free. I think they are as important to society as hospitals and roads and train stations and all of these things. This being said, the funding structure of the Berlin museums is such that the revenues we make from admission, even though it's less, all the museums I have worked in and know, the admission price is never more than, is around 15% of the total operating budget. That was the same at the Metropolitan Museum, and so since I've been here, I've been saying to everyone from the Minister of Culture to my directors, this is something we need to do, and the answer is always we can't afford it, which now I also see is true. What I want, if you do you live in Berlin? Do you know about the Jahreskarte for the museums? There is one for 25 euros a year. You can buy a Jahreskarte for the Berlin Museum for 25 euros, which you can come at times for when the museums is not very well visited, so you cannot come at any time. But we have different offers. You need to buy a year pass, and then you can come anytime you want. But it's something that, even though we advertise it, is not really as as familiar as we would wish it to be. But I'm entirely on your side. I want museums to be free. But I haven't been successful.
And Neil McGregor hasn't succeeded in that
Well,
mission.
the jury is still out. The Humboldt Forum is supposed to be free, at least for the first 3 years. And I think it's my hope that once this will create a crisis situations for museums in Berlin and in Germany, that you have a two-tier system of museums that are free and museums that aren't. And my hope is that in a new country as wealthy as Germany, the politician and government understand that this value, the person who introduced us said the political value of museums in maintaining an open society is such that society needs to support them so they can be free. At the opening of the James Simon Gallery, which is the new entrance building to the Berlin museums, Angela Merkel said something which was very important, that museums are places that allow us to think in to understand complex questions, and that museums show that there is much more that connects us than that separates us. And so this is, for me, this is the core message on a societal level of museums, and my hope is that we will, with the free access to the Humboldt Forum, that maybe not immediately, but in 5 years or in 10 years, my hope is that in 5 years or 10 years, all museums in Germany will be free to the public.
Well, that's a wonderful way to end, and we will all agree with that. But thank you very much for my speakers for a very interesting morning.